Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. So glad you're here. Today, we're diving straight into a really fascinating recent Fox News segment. We're going to neutrally unpack what happened when actor Scott Baio stopped by as a guest commentator. He dropped some serious opinions on two totally different political arenas, local California elections and the inner workings of the White House. We're going to map out exactly how Baio builds his arguments, the specific rhetorical tools he's using, and how he frames this whole concept of entrenched political power. All right, let's get into it. Right out of the gate, the host introduces Baio as their California correspondent, and Baio immediately establishes his stance, not as an insider, but as an outsider who, well, escaped. He literally says, "These people are crazy. I live in Florida. I left that crazy place." By framing himself as someone who physically packed up and moved from California to Florida, he's positioning himself as an observer, right? Someone who can see the quote-unquote madness from a safe distance. He's claiming this sort of clarity that he implies the people still stuck inside the system just don't have. Which brings us to Section 1, the California political machine. So the host asks about reality TV star Spencer Pratt and his chances at running for local office. Now, Baio actually admits that Pratt might have a real shot at winning based purely on his popularity. But then he drops this line, "They won't let him win." It's a crucial pivot. Notice how he isn't questioning Pratt's campaign strategy at all. Instead, he introduces this idea of a shadowy, entrenched they, this broader California political structure that just actively steps in to block outsiders. It's that classic framing, right? The anti-establishment outsider going up against the immovable political machine. But Baio doesn't just leave it at that vague idea. He actually gets specific about what fuels this machine. So what exactly is blocking the door here? Well, Baio points to what he calls the money train, or the gravy train. According to him, entrenched politicians are holding on to power by basically throwing money around. Specifically, he calls out homeless money and fire money as mechanisms used to, in his words, pay everybody off. He argues that an outsider like Pratt, he simply can't stop this massive flow of funds. And on top of that, he points out a huge demographic hurdle, estimating that 90% or more of the politicians in California are liberal Democrats. So for Baio, this combo of massive state funding and absolute partisan dominance creates this almost insurmountable wall. This kind of rhetoric, it's a very common populist tool. It takes incredibly complex governance and boils it down into this easily digestible narrative of an elite class using public funds just to secure their own jobs. Then, he takes the critique a whole step further. He makes this really strong, unverified claim saying, if he goes in there and looks under the hood, people should be behind bars. Wow, right? He is directly suggesting that if an outsider were to actually win and audit the system, they'd uncover literal criminal activity. This rhetoric completely elevates his commentary. We're no longer just talking about a simple disagreement over policy or partisanship. He's making a full-blown allegation of systemic, jailable corruption that is actively fighting to protect itself from any kind of scrutiny. So how on earth do you beat a machine like that? Well, the Fox News host and Scott Baio actually have slightly different takes here. The host suggests a strategy that we've seen in previous national campaigns, arguing that Pratt's voter turnout just needs to be too big to rig. The host is totally optimistic, thinking an overwhelming victory margin can completely bypass the machine. But Baio, he remains deeply skeptical. I mean, he says he prays Pratt wins, sure, but he stays hyper-focused on the structural obstacle. How do you realistically defeat a 90% entrenched political majority? For Baio, that demographic math is just a nearly impossible puzzle. All right, shifting gears to Section 2, clinging to political power. So the host pivots and brings up a recent claim from a new book by First Lady Joe Biden. The premise being presented is that on the night of the presidential debate, Joe Biden thought Joe Biden was either on drugs or had suffered a stroke. The host turns to Baio and asks a super direct question, "Are you buying that?" And honestly, this is the perfect setup. It allows Baio to offer his second major critique of political power, but this time he's focusing on narrative control rather than campaign finances. What we have here are two totally competing narratives. On one side, the official premise from the book suggests this genuine surprise and concern over a suspected medical emergency or maybe a drug issue, specifically on that debate night. But Baio, he completely rejects that premise. He explicitly says, nope, not buying it. Instead, he claims the First Lady is simply covering her rear end. His argument is that everybody already knew the president's condition for 4 years, and that dropping this narrative right now is purely a defensive tactic. It's a move to protect her own image and establish a very specific kind of defense. And that defense? It's called plausible deniability. Let's define that term really quick, because it's the exact phrase Baio uses. Plausible deniability is basically the ability to deny knowledge of or responsibility for certain actions. Baio's logic here is crystal clear. By claiming she thought something suddenly went wrong on that specific night and that the president was totally fine before the debate and totally fine after the debate, she completely absolves herself of the responsibility of having pushed a declining candidate to keep running. It gives her the cover to say, hey, I didn't know, it was just a strange incident. Understanding this tactic is absolutely crucial because plausible deniability is a classic mechanism used by people across the entire political spectrum to manage fallout and control the narrative. Now, you might be wondering, if she knew, why on earth would she push him to run in the first place? Well, Baio offers his theory right here. He says, I think the good doctor does not want to give up the limelight. I really don't. I think that's why she pushed that poor old man to keep running. Notice what he's doing here. He completely personalizes the political strategy. He strips away any ideological or, patriotic motivations for staying in the race. Instead, he attributes the entire campaign to a purely personal desire for attention and status, the limelight. To really hammer this point home, Baio details what he calls the trappings of power. I mean, what actually keeps politicians and their families clinging to office? According to Baio, it's the lifestyle. It's having to give up the big plane, the free cars, the free food, the free gym, the free everything. He argues that once political figures get a fix of this lifestyle, it becomes incredibly hard to walk away. And again, this is a highly populist argument. He's framing political leaders not as public servants, but as individuals who are practically addicted to this taxpayer-funded luxury. Recognizing this really helps us see exactly why populist messaging resonates so well. It taps directly into everyday frustrations about inequality and privilege. To illustrate just how powerful this addiction to free perks really is, Baio makes one final comparison, pointing straight at Congresswoman Maxine Waters. To emphasize his point about politicians staying in office endlessly, he uses some pretty wild hyperbole, claiming she is like 108 and still in Congress. He uses her as his ultimate example of someone who refuses to leave the system, precisely because of those free cars, free food, and free perks we just talked about. It's a massive, sweeping generalization, but it's a very effective one for wrapping up his entire thesis on the nature of political incumbency. And that brings us to the end of our breakdown today. We've seen exactly how a celebrity commentator, starting from this position of an outside observer, constructs a highly specific narrative about how power works. From the unyielding money trains of local California politics to the plausible deniability and free perks out in Washington, D.C., the underlying theme here is a deep, deep skepticism of entrenched systems and the actual motivations of the people running them. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How do celebrity voices actually shape our narratives around systemic political power? When entertainment figures start analyzing the news, how does that change the way we, the viewers, understand the motivations of our leaders? It is absolutely something worth thinking about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.